welcome to a blast from the past. This is a new segment here on Up the Cherries in all departments, and it's previous shows that I've done in the past with very notable guests. A lot of these shows were on other channels as well previously to Up the Cherries in all departments, but with their permission, I've been able to bring those across. So thank you again to Sam Davis from Back and Net, who has allowed me to use this footage. So back in 2021, we had a game during COVID with Oldham Athletic. Now, the game was due to be taking place at Boundary Park, but it was switched to Dean Court because of the icy conditions and, of course, COVID protocols. So, Oldham Athletic, a club that, are one of the smaller clubs in Manchester, but were a club who were one of the founders of the Premier League. And I managed to interview by far the most famous Oldham Athletic fan. He's into astronomy. He's written many books. He's part of the Infinite Monkey Cage podcast. He's done some great TV programs. He is one of the brightest men on this entire planet. Here is the full version of my interview with Ream, and of course, famous astronomer, Professor Brian Cox. Afternoon, Brian. How are you?
Afternoon, very well, thank you. In the circumstances, I just, knowing Boundary Park and having grown up in Oldham, it's not a surprise to me that in January the match can't be played. That was one of the great advantages of Boundary Park, actually. I think, especially when we were in the Premier League, you could see the shock on the players and the supporters' faces when they came to that ground, because it is freezing cold in January.
And to be fair, it was a shame when I saw it yesterday, because I would have loved to have seen the game played at Oldham. And I think it's the magic of the FA Cup is going away to a team where the pitch might be poor. Some pitches might resemble muddy fields, so to speak. And therefore, it gives that home team a bit of an advantage. But it has been moved to Dean Court, which will be great for us and great for Chris Temple and our team at BBC Radio Solent. But it's one of those considering the current weather conditions. So, like I say, it's a pleasure to have you on here today, Brian. Obviously, we will be talking about the weekend's game shortly, but for those who may not know much about your early years, you're actually a keyboard player for Dare and Ream. How on earth did you make the transition to the amazing work you do today?
I mean, I've been growing up in Oldham. I was interested in astronomy. I mean, one of the things about the ground, if anyone's been to Boundary Park, you'll know that it's a ground in the Pennines, and Oldham is a town in the country in many ways, and it's very easy to go up onto the hills and see this spectacular night sky. And I used to do that way back when I was, 8, 10, 12 years old. So I'd always been interested in astronomy. But then when I was about 14, 15, I got interested in music. Not as I didn't ever have lessons. It wasn't that I was kind of artistically interested in music. I was interested just in pop music. And then at the age of 15 or something, I wanted to be a pop star, as many people probably do. And I had a little band. And we'd just done a few, when I was 14, 15, they'd done some little gigs, talent contests and things around Oldham and Saddleworth. And we made a demo tape. And my dad had met Darren Wharton in the pub. And Darren Wharton he'd just left Thin Lizzy. So he was a keyboard player in Thin Lizzy. And he lived in Chadderton. And so my dad gave him this little demo tape that we'd made. And, Darren, I don't know if he paid any attention to it. But then when I was 18, I'd applied to go to university to do, get in to do physics, actually, because I'd said I like astronomy and physics, and my careers teacher at school had probably said you can't do that. There's no future in that, So I'd applied to do engineering, and I wasn't so keen. And then Darren needed a keyboard player and remembered there was this keyboard player up the road, and said, "Will you come for an audition?" And so I got the job in the band Dare, and very shortly afterwards we got a record deal with A&M Records, this huge deal. So I just kept postponing going to university, and I think that I was supposed to be at Leeds University, actually, and I think the first the anniversary, or whenever it was, September, when I was supposed to go to Leeds, I was in Hong Kong doing shows with Dare. It just really took off. So that was my route, really. And then Dare had this, for us, quite a remarkable career. We recorded 2 albums, both of them in Los Angeles. Can you believe it? I'd never been out of the country. And we ended up in Los Angeles recording albums, toured with Jimmy Page, Gary Moore, and then Europe, the band Europe, the Final Countdown. We did something like 50 odd shows with them across Europe. And then had our Spinal Tap moment and had a fight in a bar in Berlin. And I left, and the guitarist left. Then I went to university. Then I applied to University of Manchester to do physics, which is what I'd always really thought I would do anyway. So that was my strange dream. And then, actually, just to finish your question, in the year before I went to university, I needed a job, and so I was a sound engineer, and I ended up working for this band that didn't have a deal, which was Ream. And then Ream got a deal, and then said, "We need a keyboard player. Can you play the keyboards?" Because what happened with Ream is that I was at university by the time Ream started getting big, and so I did as many shows as I could. But quite often, I was in lab or something, or doing exams. There was one, actually, I remember really vividly. I was doing, I never used to like doing lab at university. And I was doing lab, and, your white coats and all that sort of stuff. And then we were supporting Take That at GMEX. And so I took the white coat off, walked up Oxford Road to GMEX in Manchester, and went on stage supporting Take That. And then went back to the university again. So I had a strange career as an undergraduate.
Yeah. Oh, amazing, though. It's so many stories as well. You could probably tell about that time.
Yeah, I'm not allowed. So I think when I'm retired, because I'd never be on the BBC again if I told the full story. I mean, being in a rock band from Oldham, and it goes back, we're talking about the football. That time in 1989, 90, which is when we got our deal, and we were sort of minor celebrities in Oldham at that time. And then, of course, the team at that time, it was the time to support Oldham. I had a season ticket all the way through, actually, but that was that time when we had the Joe Royle managing and that team, and you could read off the team, people like Dennis Irwin and Mike Milligan, Andy Ritchie, Ricky Holding, Earl Barrett, Paul Warhurst. It's just you list that team and people remember those players. And some of them, like Dennis Irwin, went on to become massively famous. But at that time, Oldham had this sort of atmosphere about it. The Inspiral Carpets were there as well as bands. So there was great music coming out of Oldham and the football team. And we all used to go to the same pubs, because there were just a few pubs. One of them called Horton Arms, actually, really quite close to the ground and close to where I lived. And the team would come in afterwards. I mean, it's such a different time, ultimately 91, 92, you're talking about a premiership, first division as it was then, and then premiership. Yeah. And, the fact that the players, the team would come into the pub after the game and sit there, it was just the most, because it's such a small town, it was such an incredible time to be in Oldham and part of Oldham. And it was, it was us, the team, Inspiral Carpets, and those people. I mean, you can only imagine what it was like.
No, it's absolutely fantastic. Just moving on to the science part, how did your knowledge and understanding of science and the universe at an early age influence your life perspective? So, for example, your beliefs, culture, and philosophy.
It's a good question. Cosmology, I learned ultimately that astronomy is, as my great hero Carl Sagan said, a humbling and character-building experience. It delivers a powerful perspective. I mean, we now know, for example, that we are one planet in orbit around one star amongst 400 billion stars in the Milky Way galaxy, which is itself one of 2 trillion galaxies in the observable universe. We're now pretty sure that the observable universe, which is the piece of the universe we can see, is a very small patch of a much larger universe, which is possibly infinite. And recently, the modern theories that are trying to address what happened at the Big Bang and why the universe is the way it is are now suggesting that perhaps there are multiple universes. Perhaps there have been an infinite number of Big Bangs and the universe has existed forever. That's a thing called the inflationary multiverse. So you're forced by astronomy, just by the act of observing and measuring our place, you're forced to concede that we're physically insignificant and very small. However, the flip side is that we're also, when you look at the history of life on Earth, it began around 3.8 to 4 billion years ago, but it took 4 billion years to go from the origin of life to, well, let's be topical, to a football team, right? to a civilization that can play football. That's a very long time. 4 billion years is a third of the age of the universe. And if you look at all the planets we've discovered, we suspect there are some, virtually every star you see in the sky has a planetary system around it. But very few of those places, we think, have been stable for something like 4 billion years, which is the time it took here to go from the origin of life to anything that you might call complicated, anything that thinks. And so I think astronomy gives you 2 perspectives. One is that we're physically insignificant, but the second perspective is we may be astonishingly valuable, because I think it's very rare that we think about what we are. We're collections of atoms that have been around since pretty much the Big Bang, or for the heavier atoms like carbon, forged in stars, at least one generation of stars. And then we've come together to be able to think under the influence of the laws of nature. And the sense that many scientists have is that has probably happened in very few places. And in fact, you can make an argument that on the average, there may be about 1 civilization per galaxy at any one time. So that makes us remarkably valuable. And I think it's that clash of ideas just through observing the universe that forces us to think very carefully about, we don't think about it very often, right, in our everyday lives, and that's normal. I mean, obviously at the moment everyone's under tremendous stress and pressure. It's a worrying time, but there is this wider perspective that we are astonishingly fortunate to be here, and I think that's what astronomy delivers.
Does having some perspective in life enable you to get over a Latinx loss a little bit more easily?
Yeah, I mean, I remember at my heyday, which is when I was in Oldham at that time. We had a roller coaster ride. I mean, I'm thinking of particularly the semi-finals against Man United, when we had this spectacular 3-3 draw last minute. I think it was Roger Palmer who scored in the last minute, and then lost in the replay. And then we had the season. Then we had Forest in the final, the League Cup final, and I remember reading that all the players said they played something like 60 odd games that year. We had the FA Cup run, League Cup run, and they were just knackered, basically. And so there were those great anti-climaxes for Oldham. And then, of course, the story of that time of Oldham was just joy and then great sadness. We were, we're probably the most famous and best loved team in the country, I think, for a couple of years, because of the way that Oldham used to play. I remember, Joe Royal would play like, you play one centre back, and I remember beating West Ham 6-0, which was just beautiful. We just completely destroy teams. But then you'd get these moments where a team like Man United would sneak it in injury time. And I don't think anything, no amount of perspective on the size and scale of the universe can prepare you for United sneaking it in injury time. I remember Mark Hughes, this wonder goal that he scored at Boundary Park. That it just I don't know how he did it. It was one of the, I think, and Mark Robbins scored, didn't he? And a lot of people say that was the goal that saved Alex Ferguson. You know, that one moment. United were doing really badly at the time.
And just moving on to, are you generally optimistic or pessimistic? And have the recent world events changed that in any way?
I'm optimistic because I think that it's interesting. You talk about the pandemic, I suppose. What you've seen there is these things have happened throughout history. It's the first thing to say. We've been in a constant battle with viruses throughout our whole evolutionary history. In fact, it's likely that a great deal that one of the reasons that we're here is that constant evolutionary tussle between us and viruses, and life and viruses. That's been going on for 3.5 billion years, right? It's part of evolution. But the difference this time is the remarkable speed with which we developed the vaccines. So when this time last year, we just discovered this virus. It jumped to humans, was it November, I suppose, just over a year ago. And had been discovered in China around 12 months ago. Genetic sequencing was done, which is remarkable. We couldn't do that 10 or 15 years ago. And then we developed vaccines, some of which are using new technologies, which will now be deployed against many other diseases. So in the space of 12 months, we've seen a new virus. We've developed the vaccines are rolling out. That's incredible. And so I think that shows you that if we invest in research and development and education and continue to do it, because remember that expertise wasn't just invented 12 months ago when it was needed. It comes from investment over decades in knowledge and education. If we continue to do that, what you see is that we can do remarkable things. I mean, it is astonishing the speed with which we've developed and now are deploying the vaccines. So that gives me great optimism. There are many reasons to be pessimistic. They tend to be political, though, in a sense, not party political, but in the sense that the challenge now is how we deploy the knowledge that we have. Remarkably, we're able to see that we're damaging the environment, for example, global warming. We can see it because we've got satellites up there primarily that are looking down at the Earth and making precision measurements on the way the climate's changing. We have supercomputers that allow us to model the way the climate changes. So we know the problem. Again, if you go back, I mentioned Carl Sagan before. Carl Sagan once said that if the dinosaurs had had a space program, they'd still be around, right? Which is kind of a joke. Yeah. But actually, it's not a joke in the sense that we are now in a position where we can see threats coming. We see them, and usually, broadly speaking, we can do something about them if we choose. Now, the challenge now is to get our politicians, which means our society, actually, because we're democracies, so we're all responsible for the direction of our country. It's to get people to understand the power and the responsibility that comes from the knowledge that we've generated, and we use it wisely. That's a challenge, but we can do that. It's not as if this is something that we can do nothing about. As we've seen with the pandemic, we can do something about it, and we are doing so. So that's why I'm optimistic. I mean, it comes down ultimately, I think, to having a population, that's you and me and everybody that's listening, who have some not knowledge of science, because we all have our jobs, we all have things to do. We can't all spend time learning about everything in the world, but have a basic understanding of what it means to make a scientific statement, what reliable knowledge is, and which experts to trust and which voices not to trust, and to try to make a reasoned decision about a sensible way forward. That's the challenge now. But that's a challenge for all of us. Just to think.
And just staying on the topic of the pandemic, what effect have recent events had on the environment, with more people working from home than ever before?
Well, you see it said. I mean, I don't know is the answer. I've seen, so it said anecdotally that there have been some. It's hard, isn't it? You don't want to say positive effects. I mean, obviously, if you're traveling less and there's less air travel and so on, then globally emissions go down. But this is not the way to do it, right? So I'm not one of those people who says, well, at least there's a silver lining to the. It's hard to argue there's a silver lining to this cloud, right? It's a tremendously destructive thing. I think if there's a positive effect, ultimately, I think it'll be in our attitude to nature. I mean, it shows yet again that nature is not something that is not benign, and you can't ignore it. And it's not going to be okay if we just sit there with a head in the sand. This applies to climate change, but it applies also to pandemics. Right? It won't be okay. These things come. These things happen. The key point, though, as I said before, is to notice that we have the intellectual capacity to do something about it. The challenge now is, do we have the political capacity to do something about it?
I promise, Brian, we will talk about the football very, very soon. But some people form emotional attachments to scientific misapprehensions. Should we try and correct or guide these people? And if so, how do we do that?
I think it's education is at the base. I think I've alluded to it before. Our problems and our opportunities ultimately come from how well we educate people. That starts, of course, with children. That's where it starts. If I were given power, if people voted for me, I think the first thing I would do is make sure that all of us listening have children. What we really want, I think, one of the key things is that our children go to schools where they're educated to the best of their ability. And if you can do that, and if you can teach critical thinking at school, and if you can teach children, children need to be exposed to a wide range of ideas. We're not just talking about science now, by the way. We're talking about the arts and music and sports. Those things, that's where the future lies. It's easy to say, but I firmly believe it. Again, I mean, I keep referring to Carl Sagan because if people haven't read any of Carl Sagan's books, Cosmos was his very famous TV series, but he wrote a great book called The Demon Haunted World. Science as a Candle in the Dark, which is kind of an attempt to answer your question. And he said that the thing is, in a democracy, everybody has a say on the future of the country. With that, there is a responsibility to make sure that everybody can have an informed say on the future of the country. And that means that you really need citizens who are at least aware of the progress in science and engineering and arts and sport and music. You need just a broad kind of understanding of those things, because you're going to take decisions about them. Right? Your vote is, if it's not an informed decision, then democracy is in trouble. And how do you make an informed decision? Well, it's down to us as a society to demand the best possible education for our children. That's the way to do it. You can't, to go to the centre of your question, you can't do it by bullying people and saying, well, you're an idiot if you think the earth's flat or something. You are an idiot if you think the earth's flat. But it's not going to get us anywhere. And you might say, well, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you think the earth's flat, whatever. Maybe it doesn't matter. But the point is that there's a strong correlation, which we do see, between people who believe in one conspiracy theory, which is, I mean, by the way, I don't understand why it's a conspiracy theory, because I don't understand what anyone has to gain. I can understand it if there are conspiracies saying, well, these people make a lot of money if they say that, whatever, chopping down trees is a good idea because they want to get loads of wood. But I mean, the earth being flat, what possible reason is there for keeping that quiet? Anyway, but there's a strong correlation between that and distrust of experts in many other areas. And if you distrust experts in climate change or vaccination policy or public health policy, that does have consequences. And so I think that's the key. That's what we have to address. That I'm almost saying that there's no such thing as a harmless conspiracy theory.
Mhm.
So when you meet your mate down the pub and they go, well, I think we didn't land on the moon, it's kind of funny, well, whatever. But actually, that person is much more likely to believe that there's no point in being vaccinated.
Yes.
And that's the problem.
Yeah, most definitely. You're well known, Brian, for making things that are complicated fairly simple for viewers to understand, people like myself. I was just wondering if you thought football has gone the other way, as these days there seems to be a bit more of a reliance on statistical analysis, scatter charts, tactical formations. Do you subscribe to this way of analysing football matches, or are we simply overcomplicating the beautiful game?
Well, I suppose it's inevitable, isn't it? Because on the one side, it is true that the more information and data you have, and the better you're able to model the way that a complex system works, in this case, a football team or two football teams on a pitch, then the better you will do. Right. So the more information you've got, the more likely it is that you will do well. But I do share that view that that there's football is a science and an art, isn't it? Which many things are both sciences and arts, and you can't analyze away Messi, for example, right? So there's genius at work as well, and I think that's the same in music. You referred to my early music career. You can take lessons in playing the guitar or the piano until you're blue in the face and become technically brilliant. But you're not going to write a song like the Beatles. so there's something. I think that the same goes for football. So I suppose my answer is it's inevitable, because if you can get even the slightest edge, because the rewards are so great and there's so much money in it. Now you can. It's interesting. We talk about Oldham. If you go back to that time, that those seasons, 1991, 89, 1991, Oldham played with. I've seen interviews with particularly people like Ricky Holding, who's my favorite player, I think. I mean, one of the great left wingers, that he just ran past people, perfect crosses every time. Someone like Ian Marshall or Andy Ritchie would stick it in the net. And but he said that a great deal of the reason for the success of that team was that they were actually all friends. And they did actually all go out to the pub afterwards. And I know, because I used to be with them in the pub. And you used to get lock-ins in those days, because it wasn't as kind of harsh as it is now. And but so there was something there's something intangible about the way that team played, because they were all mates. There were no prima donnas. They'd all come together. Joe Royle had this attitude that just go and attack, and he had a philosophy for the way the game is played. And I think that's art. That's not science. There was very little science, I think, in that team. It was just like attack. And we had, was it Paul Warhurst and Earl Barrett at the time, centre backs? I mean, they were so fast. Those two, they were mainly in the opposition half of the pitch, and I think that's not. You wouldn't do that if you tried to analyze the way that you were, the way that you were shipping goals, for example.
Yeah.
Why did someone score 4 goals against us? I don't know. It doesn't matter, does it? We didn't score 5. I mean, I think that was the philosophy.
Well, at the moment, Oldham sit 14th in League Two, 6 points off the playoff places. What do you think the expectations for the club was at the start of the season?
I mean, recently, I haven't been, I don't live in Oldham anymore, so I haven't been to a game for quite a while. I think we've been through a really difficult time. And, I think to be comfortable mid-table, and as you said, potentially pushing towards the playoffs, I get the sense that exceeds expectations. So there, if you're 6 points off the playoffs at this stage in the season, then you've got a chance. My time supporting Oldham was that time when I was, from the age of about, I don't know what the first game was that I went to. It was with my dad. I was probably 12 or 13, I suppose, because we could walk up to Boundary Park from my house. So it was those days, and then when I left the town sort of Not until I went to do a PhD, so it's probably like 93, 94, something like that, 95, when I started to lose it, which seems like yesterday to me, but it's actually a while ago, isn't it? so, so I always just, I mean, what I do, because you always have it, I think, if you supported a team and been to games in the past, I always have a look. So I always on a Saturday afternoon I'll have a look at the results, but I haven't seen Oldham play now for quite a while. I need to go. Some people contact me occasionally from the club, and invite me up. And I did some. They have a great charity sort of outreach program in Oldham, an educational charity outreach, and so I did a little bit of that at my old school actually, and some of the players came down. So and then the pandemic, of course. So I haven't been able to get up there, but I must go and see a game. I was going to say the ground's better now. It used to be. I mean, it was standing in the at Boundary Park in the Cherry Road end when
now, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, Oldham have been part of many FA Cup surprises previously. You beat Man City, Liverpool, and more recently Fulham as well.
Yeah.
Do you envisage another surprise on the cards for us on Saturday?
You can never tell in the cup, can you? I just don't know. But that I mean, it's a cliche, isn't it? I mean, it's one of the great footballing cliches, but it is the place where anything can happen. And so I have no idea. I mean, it's a shame that, just to reiterate what you said at the start, I think it's a shame that that match isn't being played at Boundary Park, because it's a great ground.
Oh yeah,
it's got a real character to it. It always, so even now, although it's been developed to some extent, it looks like the football grounds I grew up with. Certainly in my mind, it's still one of those grounds. So yeah. We're at a disadvantage now, I suppose, not playing at Boundary Park.
Yeah, and I do this with everybody, Brian. What's your prediction for tomorrow?
I probably, because the weather's going to be, it's freezing cold, isn't it? Although it'd be probably quite nice. What's the weather forecast? Is it?
Oh, it's freezing down here. It was -2 last night, so
yeah, but it might be sunny.
Yeah,
I'm going to go for 1-1.
Well, there's no replays this year, but do you think?
Oh no, there isn't. No, you're right, aren't there? Yeah, you're right. You can't have 1-1, can you?
No.
Yeah. All right, I'll go for Oldham win then.
Oldham win.
Yeah.
Fair enough, Brian. Well, before you go, I just wanted to touch upon your up-and-coming tour, Horizons, which takes place later this year and then is going globally next year as well. Do tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, it's we'd planned it ages ago. It was I did a big tour a couple of years ago and really enjoyed it. And so I got, there's one central idea, which is I was talking to a friend of mine about who's a conductor, sort of classical music conductor. And I was talking about 2001, which is one of my favorite films, probably my favorite film, and said to him, the music, what should Kubrick have done, right? If he could have done something better in that film. And he told me about this music by Sibelius, this Finnish composer, and said it's, and if you listen to it, it's for those that want to, it's the Fifth Symphony, the third movement of the Fifth Symphony, and it's all the science fiction films you've ever heard. It was written in 1914, 1915. So during the First World War, just before Finland had a civil war, which is hard to believe now, 100 years later, that Finland had a civil war just 100 years ago. But yeah, it's this tremendously optimistic vision of nature and an optimistic vision of what we could become. It feels like, which is what 2001 was basically about as well. Yeah. So I had this idea that the more we learn about the universe, the more, as I said before, the more remarkable it seems that we exist at all. But there's also this sense that because we're very rare, we have in some sense a responsibility to be more. So what could we become if we take the right decisions now? and we continue to learn about nature, and we continue to solve the problems that face us, pandemic, disease, climate change, and so on, what could we become? And so it's a live show with enormous screens. We every time I go out, I try to put bigger screens in. So at Bournemouth, by the way, I think it's one of the smallest venues that we can get the full screen in. So it will be. I mean, the screens are built for the O2 and places like that, but I think we can just about get it in. So it's going to be a wall of high definition LED. And we've been generating. I've been working on graphics. We're going to talk about black holes and what happens when you fall into a black hole, the origin of the universe, the origin of life, but also all the way through this optimistic vision of what our future might be. So hints of our future and almost sort of science fiction vision. And I'm actually working with this remarkable artist in Stockholm, Eric Vernquist, who just creates these worlds, these graphical worlds that I want to live in. When I was growing up, the things I was doing was watching Oldham Athletic and being into science fiction. And having those, you probably people remember those books you could get with, there's one called Spacecraft 2000 to 2100 that I had, which had these visions of space liners going to Mars and things like that. And this future that I wanted to live in. And so there's a hint of that in the show as well. What might our future be like? But the central physics in it is that I'm writing a book at the moment on black holes, because black holes are just very recently we've been beginning to understand them. I think it's been a quest that. I mean, Stephen Hawking was asking difficult questions about black holes back in the 60s and 70s, back in the 70s. And certainly early 80s, and we're just now beginning to understand a very simple idea, actually, which is what happens. A simple question that Stephen first asked, which is what happens if you throw a book, let's say, or a hard disk or something into a black hole. What happens to the information? Does it vanish from the universe forever, or does it somehow come back into the universe? And that question has been generating vast amounts of theoretical physics for 50 years. And just this year, I think we're beginning to get a handle on it. And not to go into too much detail, but it seems that the answer to that question is yes, the information comes out. But the way it comes out requires us to build a new theory of space and time. And it's beginning to look like space and time are things that emerge from something else. So they're not fundamental. So the thing that we sit and look at our watch and time passes and there's, we're in a room and that's space. That looks like it's not a fundamental description of reality. And that's incredible. So by studying these things, these collapsed stars in the sky, we are beginning to be led to a view of reality that is completely divorced from the world that we think we live in. And that's a beautiful example of the way that science works. So we're right at the heart of that show. Although there's the optimism and the music and a celebration of nature, but there's also there's going to be this rather spectacular graphical sort of journey into black holes. And I'm going to talk about what that's teaching us about the fundamental nature of reality with big graphics, with big screens and big speakers. So it'll be a spectacle.
So as Brian's just said there, you will be at the BIC in Bournemouth on the 27th of October this year, Brian, won't you?
Yeah. I'm confident that it's an act of optimism, isn't it? Because, at the moment it's so difficult to see that, we could even get back into a football ground, right? Which is outside, never mind the inside. But I do think that with the vaccines rolling out now, I think you have to be an optimist, don't you? Exactly. And I think we can be optimistic. I mean, we've got, 2 vaccines now, another 2 or 3 actually just about to be certified, I think. So if we get this right, I think that hopefully we'll have dealt with this. What can we do at the moment? I mean, I should say that because those vaccines are now being rolled out, the way that we deal with it now, and everyone's been saying it, is just to stay safe now. We're almost there. We've gone through this tremendously difficult year, another few months, and you can see an end. So I'm tremendously optimistic that we'll be able to do those shows in October.
And the website to go to get tickets is briancoxlive.co.uk.
I think you can just type it in. If you go Brian Cox, it'll come up on Google.
It does. And if you're not local, there are going to be many shows across the UK, and then moving across to the Far East, Australia and New Zealand as well in 2022, Brian.
And then
So-
US and Canada, and then and then a bit of Scandinavia, I think, as well.
Fantastic. So any of our international cherries, check it out as well. And also all the programs as well that you've done will be on Google Play and any other service for people to download as well.
Yeah, you can always get them somewhere. I've made so many of them now that people, because I teach at the University of Manchester, and some of the students, so I teach first year, so they're 18 years old, and they say, yeah, when I was 6, I remember watching your show. You go, God, really? It's a long time ago, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I speak for every Bournemouth fan, Brian, in saying thank you for joining me today on the show. It's been really insightful, really interesting. All the very best for the up and coming tour, and the very best for everything in the future. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you, and good luck. Good luck. I mean, maybe I should have said, maybe my prediction should have been that Bournemouth might sneak it. It's probably more likely, isn't it? I'm an optimist, though,
Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure, Brian. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
And thank you everybody for joining us on this show. Remember to hit the like, the subscribe, the bell button below to be alerted to any new videos we do here. Thank you again for watching. Leave your comments as well. And of course, this interview was out of this world. So honestly, it's one of my proudest moments of all time. To speak to somebody who is, is so clever, makes, difficult things sound really easy. Let's be honest, black holes, supernovas, the galaxy, space, they're all quite complex. But with Professor Brian Cox, it just simplifies them. So thank you again to Professor Brian Cox during the COVID period for doing that interview. It, like I say, was an absolute pleasure. Remember, hit that like, the subscribe, the bell button, and thank you again for watching.